War. Since the early days of mankind, war has ravaged across the globe. In the name of good or evil, to attack or defend, war has created empires and destroyed nations. Since the time of Alexander the Great, results on the battlefield had much to do with the great generals who led their armies to victory or followed them into exile. A great military mind was able to see an opportunity where others saw only a lost cause. A great general was able to develop a plan of attack that could outwit an opponent or respond to an offensive action with speed and agility. In the 20th century came the greatest war the world had ever known. A war between many nations that pitted modern armor, aircraft, and weaponry on a scale unimaginable by the armies of old. World War II. In this war, many were called to greatness. Leaders emerged from small country towns and large urban areas. No nation was more blessed with military leaders than the United States of America. Generals who rose from the ranks to lead their troops to battle. Men who were born to greatness, and men who had greatness thrust upon them. This is their story. The famous generals of World War II. They were legends in their own time and remain so today. Their lives were an inspiration, and their deeds the stuff of history. Here now is the story of General Dwight D. Eisenhower. 1945. Dwight David Eisenhower returns to his hometown a true war hero. The man who led the greatest armada in the greatest war America had ever fought was returning home, and the warmth with which the people of Abilene, Kansas greeted this distinguished general reflected the deep joy of a nation approaching peace again. Some of it was the kind of welcome any hometown might give a favorite son who had done a good job. But more than anything else, it was a tribute, a gratitude felt in every corner of the Allied world, no less than in Abilene, towards a man who led the free world to its victory. It was a great war with many battles and many triumphs, but it found its symbol in one day above all others. D-Day, June the 6th, 1944. The invasion of Fort was one of the greatest military adventures of all time. But on the outcome of this bold adventure hung the fate of war and freedom. It was because so much of man's hope had been bound up in the success of this adventure that the architect of that success found the hearts of the people open to him from Europe to Abilene, the town of his boyhood, where the adventure of Dwight D. Eisenhower the man began. The Eisenhower Museum in Abilene is visited daily by citizens from all parts of the country, ranging from dignitary to school. Inside the museum, the life of Dwight Eisenhower, boy and man, is depicted in a series of murals. From infancy, that life had the flavor of grassroots America. Eisenhower was born in 1890 in Denison, Texas, of parents whose families had migrated to Pennsylvania from Europe and thence to the American Midwest. Young Eisenhower's parents had lived in Abilene before his birth, and it was Abilene, once the wild town at the end of the Chisholm Trail, now a peaceful village of the plains, to which they returned when he was an infant. And it was here that he grew to maturity through a childhood that was active, eager, and happy. An experience shared with devoted parents and spirited brothers, a childhood as rich in the important things of life as ever graced the development of any man. It was an active boyhood in which sports played an important part. He excelled at baseball, both in school and on a vacant lot next to his home. But football was his first love, and his high school coach called him the most outstanding tackle in the Valley. Dwight D. Eisenhower's home overflowed with patriotism as well as faith, and of respect for things of the mind. Work was also a staple of the family routine. The creamery where young Eisenhower worked during his spare time while he was in school was one of Abilene's light industries. In this way, and by these standards, young Dwight Eisenhower grew to a manhood the world would one day know well. He was 20 when he left Abilene for the military academy at West Point. Many a great American has begun his march into history as a cadet on the plain at West Point. Eisenhower was graduated from the military academy in 1915 and commissioned a second lieutenant of infantry. A new phase of life was beginning. In the summer of 1916, as a newly promoted first lieutenant stationed at Fort Sam Houston, Texas, he married Mamie Geneva Dowd of Denver. Events in Europe were forging a new phase of life for the entire world. World War I gave many a future general his first experience with combat, but young Eisenhower was not among them. World War I brought him instead command of a tank training center at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, where he prepared troops of the new tank corps for overseas duty. His performance won for him the Distinguished Service Medal, but before he was able to get to Europe, the war ended. In the late 1920s, after graduation from the Command and General Staff School, Major Dwight D. Eisenhower was assigned to France to prepare a guidebook on American battlefields in Europe. It was his first direct experience with that continent. With the 30s came other assignments, climaxed by service under General Douglas MacArthur in the Philippines. For 4 years, he worked with MacArthur, who was Commander-in-Chief of the Philippine Army, to help the Commonwealth government work out a plan for its military defense. Ordered back to the States in December 1939, Lieutenant Colonel Eisenhower went to Fort Lewis, Washington as executive officer of the 15th Infantry Regiment. In the dark spring of 1940, German armored divisions were crashing through Holland and Belgium. The Luftwaffe was streaking its destruction through Europe's skies. France was prostrate, and beleaguered Britain was standing alone. The United States had passed the Selective Service Act to prepare for what inevitably lay ahead. And the biggest challenge in Colonel Eisenhower's life was to aid in that preparation. Late in 1940, he was made Chief of Staff of the 3rd Division, where his staff work brought him assignment as Chief of Staff of the 9th Corps. In the summer of 1941, Colonel Eisenhower became Chief of Staff to General Walter Kruger, whose newly organized Third Army was preparing to participate in the most realistic war maneuvers yet held by American troops. In these maneuvers over the Louisiana countryside, as America fought for the time to train its growing army of citizen soldiers, Eisenhower's task was to work out a plan of defense against an invading mechanized force. Soon after the maneuvers were over, Eisenhower was promoted to Brigadier General, and within a matter of days came the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Almost this moment on, the fate of the nation and the fate of General Dwight D. Eisenhower would be bound together. Called to Washington in the first weeks after the war began, Eisenhower went to work in the War Plans Office of the War Department. Among the plans formulated during this time was the strategic decision to make an eventual attack across the English Channel, the principal Allied offensive effort. Because an all-out Channel invasion would be impossible before 1944, and because the need for offensive action was immediate in 1942, the Allies undertook, as a combined operation under the command of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the invasion of North Africa. The minimum objective of this maneuver was to seize the main ports between Casablanca and Algiers. Along the rim of the North African coast, troops were ashore in late November, encountering little real resistance in the Algiers area to a strong, ongoing battle at Casablanca. The commander's hope was to push quickly east along the Mediterranean and take the important ports of Bizerte and Tunis. Events moved swiftly. To Algiers came General Anderson, commanding the British First Army. General Giraud took command of the French land forces. United under General Eisenhower, they were ready to take the field. Once more, the tricolor, the stars and stripes, and the Union Jack flew side by side. But the enemy had lost no time. Across the Mediterranean by sea and by air, he was pouring men and equipment into Tunis. Despite this, the Allies were determined to start the campaign at once, hoping to reach the distant cities before the enemy's grasp had become too strong. The Allies managed to fight their way across the desert to the Tunisian border. But then, the German attack almost forced them back into the desert. From the skies, a bombardment caused great damage to the Allied effort. Soon, supplies became scarce. Casualties were heavy. Even as the goal was in sight, the race had been lost. This first thrust had failed. In the spring, battle lines were drawn. In the north stood the British First Army. In the center, General Giraud's French troops. In the south, the Americans. Farther south, a small group of fighting French had completed its historic 1,500-mile march and taken up positions on the left flank of the British Eighth Army, which faced the formidable Mareth line. Behind stood Rommel's army. Tunisia was crowded with German troops, 15 full divisions, all well-experienced fighters. Were battle-wise veterans of Poland, France, the Baltics. Together with 7 Italian divisions, they were armed with the most modern types of equipment, including the newest fighters and bombers of the German Luftwaffe. German orders were, hold Tunisia at all costs. Keep control of the Mediterranean. Of the various strategies to be employed against the Germans, General Eisenhower chose one which he hoped would shape the entire military situation in terms of a cylinder. The western wall was Allied land forces along the great dorsal mountain range. The northern and eastern, Allied air and sea power concentrated in the Mediterranean. The seaports of Tunis and Bizerte were to act as the intake valve through which those enemy troops who escaped the devastating impacts of planes and submarines based at Malta were to be sucked into the cylinder. At the bottom of the cylinder stood the powerful British Eighth Army, to serve as the piston, which in its upward stroke would push the enemy into an ever smaller space. Still in possession of the Nazis were certain high hills to the west of Tunis and Bizerte. Their capture was an essential part of the entire strategy. Because the hills were the spark plug, which, when the piston had forced the enemy into a state of high compression, would explode in a combustible mass. That was the final strategy. To succeed, perfect coordination would be necessary between land, sea, and air forces. The blow was now struck by 50,000 men on the ground and by bombers, fighters, and tank busters from the air. The Germans, moving their armor too late, were pinned down by the British at Mareth. The New Zealanders drove through. The Mareth line had been turned. The piston was on the move, its speed made possible by the feats in road building by the South African engineers. Air and naval forces shelled and bombed all along the seawall. Fighters struck at their troop transport planes, knocking them out of the sky by the hundreds. And on land, the British First Army was a constant threat in the north, while in the center, the French had attacked at Pichon. And farther south, the Americans had broken through to El Batar and Mamassi, thus enforcing constant pressure all along the land wall of the cylinder. April 7th, American patrols of light tanks striking eastward met patrols of the British 8th Army advancing northward. For 12 days, the hills west of Tunis echoed with fire. Positions were taken, lost, and retaken. When the German lines broke at last, their dead lay in hundreds, unburied on the battlefield. As Allied infantry went forward, engineers built roads across the mountaintops for vital supplies to reach them. In 14 days, 11 miles were built. The Allies now felt it was time to bring the battle to a close. British and Americans in the air with everything that could fly. British and Americans on the ground with everything that could shoot. French artillery. French infantry. The British Navy. All poured forth their concentrated fury. This was Blitz warfare, such as the inventors of the Blitz had never dreamed of. The Nazi challenge to the free world to fight or surrender was being answered. After only 8 hours of fighting, the hard crust of German resistance was shattered. Allied armor crashed through. The Americans blitzed their way into Bizerte. British smashed right through the center to capture Tunis. Then a British armored column crashed across the neck of the cape to Hammamet. Another British column raced around the tip of the cape to prevent any evacuation. The whole Axis mass was split into 4 segments. The end came quickly. By tens, by hundreds, by thousands came. On foot, in trucks and behind their bands, the greatest surrender of fully equipped troops in modern history. Allied losses totaled nearly 70,000 men, dead, wounded, and missing. 35,000 British, 18,000 Americans, 15,000 French. But for every man the Allies had lost, the Germans had lost 5. And at the end, 15 full divisions, 266,000 of Germany's best men laid down their arms. With this victory came the end of the Axis Empire in Africa. The Allied leaders and the men who had fought under them proudly commemorated their victory. One of the greatest products of this victory, in the words of the commander himself, was the progress achieved in the welding of Allied unity, in the establishment of a combat team that was already showing the effects of a growing confidence and trust among all its members. The successful end of the campaign brought personal recognition of Eisenhower throughout the world as a great leader. But the commander himself interpreted this recognition as proof that free men can find in unity the way to victory, even against seemingly invincible odds. The next big campaign, the invasion of Sicily, brought further demonstration of this basic truth. Allied troops took this vital area in the summer of 1943. The effect of Sicily's fall was monumental. Italy surrendered, the first of the Axis partners to capitulate. And now, the Allies prepared for what was to be the most fiercely fought battle of the Mediterranean War, the invasion of Italy itself at Salerno. Through a miracle of courage and tenacity, troops of General Mark Clark's Fifth Army established a beachhead against overwhelming German odds, and went on to take Salerno and the vital port of Naples. With these victories, although heavy fighting and important battles lay ahead, the first major objectives of the Italian campaign were accomplished. Allied forces were on European soil and would be able to pin down German troops far from the scene of the cross-channel invasion planned for the following year. President Roosevelt visited the combat area with General Eisenhower when he came over for the Cairo and Tehran conferences, where agreement was once again established that the principal Allied effort would be the invasion of Europe. Shortly afterward, the man who would command this awesome undertaking was named General Dwight D. Eisenhower, whom people throughout the free world would now call the man of the hour. The Supreme Commander's orders from the combined Chiefs of Staff were quite simple: to land on the coast of France, and thereafter to destroy the German ground forces. But it would take a great deal of effort to execute these orders. Across the Channel, the heavy fortifications lining the coast of France bespoke the Nazis' belief that they could push the invading armies back into the sea. In France alone, 58 German divisions were waiting. Preparing for the invasion was a job that required great effort. Incessant and realistic training was of paramount importance. The challenges of morale, the myriad details of coordination on every level, all these were overwhelming. But through those tense months in the early part of 1944, the preparations continued. Intelligence was needed, so agents were parachuted into France or put ashore by submarine or small boat. Every square mile of the Normandy coast was photographed. Arms and ammunition were dropped to the French underground. The weather was studied. Equipment was stockpiled for delivery to the beachhead. Ships of all sorts, new and old, were prepared.
I assumed command at Schaeff with the best all-round team for which a man could ask. Some had already been working for months in England. Others I brought with me from the Mediterranean. We adopted first a master plan, and then had to coordinate every last detail of the ground, sea, and air plans. While this was going on, we led off with an air show designed to make the landing points as soft as possible, to batter the German communications, and to make certain we'd have control of the air. It was quite a show. Those airmen did a magnificent job.
Polish, Czech, French, British, and American flyers bombed and strafed German marshalling yards. Supply and troop trains were targeted. Almost all the bridges over the Seine River were destroyed between Paris and the sea. In the late spring of 1944, the invasion plans came alive with the movement of troops and materiel through the southern towns of Great Britain to the ports on the Channel. Across the Channel, aware of the impending invasion attempt, the Germans stood by their guns. Reinforcements arrived from the Reich. The German generals were prepared, their armored might at the ready. They looked across the Channel at Britain and declared death to any invasion attempt. Finally, after being postponed one day because of weather conditions, the eve of the day of decision was at hand. The commander visited the airborne troops who would lead the invasion. "I found the men in fine fettle," he wrote later, joshingly admonishing me that I had no cause for worry. Troops were loaded aboard the Armada. They knew this was the greatest invasion fleet that had ever sailed. They had trained long and hard for this moment. Jokes relieved some of the tension, yet apprehension gripped every man. At the final briefing, the men were told where they were going and when they were to hit the beach. They were told how far inland they would have to fight to link up with the airborne troops. On the eve of battle, Mass was said. In the morning, they would face the Germans.
From the moment of embarkation to that of landing, the full burden fell upon the Navy and our merchant fleets. They had to sweep the mines, bombard the coastal batteries, marshal and protect the transports along the coastline preparatory to landing, and, finally, man the small boats that carried the soldiers to the beach. On that day, there were more than 8,000 ships and landing craft on the shores of Normandy. It was a most intricate task and a vital one for the success of our plans. The courage, fidelity, and skill of the Royal and American Navies have no brighter page in their histories than that of June 6, 1944.
D-Day, with the fate of the war hanging in the balance. Half a million troops, backed by millions more, faced outward across the stormy sea. On beaches that dotted the French coast of the Channel, British, Canadian, and American troops touched shore. The first fateful moment passed, and Allied troops were holding on French soil. In London, all was quiet. Only a few people knew. The secret had been tightly kept. Around daybreak, correspondents were called and told to be at the Ministry of Information at 8 a.m. And then the whole world knew that the Allies had a foothold on the European continent. One week after the landings, the commander was able to say to the vast armies under him, "Your accomplishments in the last 7 days of this campaign have exceeded my highest hopes." Less than 2 months after the invasion, the Allied force broke out of the beachhead perimeter in the headway country around Saint-Lô. Completion of the breakout was the next step, and then began the dramatic pursuit, spearheaded by General George S. Patton's armored force across the heart of France. And then the grand, triumphant march through Paris, which was freed by French troops and soldiers of the U.S. Fifth Corps. Beyond Paris lay the liberation of Belgium and the yard-by-yard struggle across the German border. Blocking the steady pursuit of victory lay the Nazi counteroffensive in the Ardennes sector, known as the Battle of the Bulge. Through a grim and bleak period of several weeks, the enemy, supported by the most devastating of weather conditions, isolated and assaulted Allied forces. General Eisenhower called upon all troops to rise to new heights of courage and effort. The brave men of the beleaguered forces held and steadily began pressing the enemy back. And from that moment onward, the Supreme Commander counted on weakened Nazi resistance. The bridge at Remagen across the Rhine, one of the sturdiest symbols of the war. With its crossing in March 1945, the heart of Germany's defenses was cracked. There remained the substantial task of mopping up what was left of the Nazi army west of the Rhine, and accepting their surrender in the droves that began to appear. The great cities of the German fatherland were rubble as Allied troops moved through them in the last stages of defeat. Both commander and GI were able to find the exultation that comes when victory is close. Victory came finally with the German surrender in a schoolhouse at Reims on May the 7th, 1945. The return to peace was signaled by the Supreme Commander.
I have the proud privilege of speaking for a victorious army of almost 5 million fighting men. They and the women who have so ably assisted them constitute the Allied expeditionary forces that have liberated Western Europe. They have captured or destroyed enemy armies totaling more than their own strength. Merely to name my principal subordinates in the Canadian, French, American, and British forces is to present a picture of the utmost in efficiency, skill, loyalty, and devotion to duty. The United Nations will gratefully remember Tedder, Montgomery, Spaatz, Bradley, Villatte, Creer, and many others. But all these agree with me in the selection of the truly heroic figure of this war. He is G.I. Joe and his counterpart in the air, the Navy, and the merchant marine of every one of the United Nations. He has braved the dangers of U-boat infested seas. He has surmounted charges into desperately defended beaches. He has fought his tedious, patient way through the ultimate in fortified zones. He has endured cold, hunger, fatigue. His companion has been danger. Death has dogged his footsteps. He and his platoon commanders have given us an example of loyalty, devotion to duty, and indomitable courage that will live in our hearts as long as we admire those qualities in men.
And then the long and happy road home. For Dwight Eisenhower, that road was paved with the cheers of the people of the Allied countries. In his own homeland, a hero's welcome awaited him. America's greeting for a favorite son. Here, the story of Dwight D. Eisenhower might well have ended on this note of triumphant acclaim for a job so splendidly done. But America had other tasks waiting for its favorite soldier. Eisenhower succeeded General Marshall as the Army's first post-war chief of staff. He expressed the belief that one of the greatest pillars of world peace is a strong United States. He visited troops stationed in various parts of the world to show America's growing sense of global responsibility. "We must remain," he said, "the first champions of those who seek to lead their own lives in peace with their neighbors." Finally, on February the 7th, 1948, the general from Abilene, after 36 years of service to his country, left active military assignment, but not active participation in the life of his nation. He accepted an invitation from Columbia University to serve as president of that great institution, enabling him, so he thought at the time, to devote the remainder of his life to the challenges of education. But events of the post-war world dictated otherwise. The urgent necessity for unity in the free world brought into being the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And it was evident from the outset that only one man could make that vital and complicated organization work: Dwight D. Eisenhower. At the end of 1950, he answered his country's call once more, and once more he was on European soil to assume supreme command of the land, the sea, and the air forces of a great defensive alliance. Against a new threat rising from the Soviets, who had once been his nation's ally, he had to create in the war-weary European soul the will to defend itself, so that freedom so dearly bought would not be lost. For more than a year, he labored diligently at his task of coalition. When he turned over the reins of command to General Matthew Ridgway, the structure of military unity among free nations, on which rested the hope for continued peace, was established. Once again, with the accomplishment of substantial victory behind him, this might well have been the end of his public career, and in a sense it was. The closing chapter in the story of Eisenhower the soldier. History then recorded the story of Eisenhower the president, and later the elder statesman. But that is a story unto itself. This story takes place before his 2 full terms as President of the United States. This is the story of a simple, honest American who led the world's armies to victory in the greatest war in history. Dwight David Eisenhower will always be remembered as one of the greatest generals of World War II.